Hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker, and today I'm over the moon. This is not just a special treat. This is a an extra special treat for me. It's an event in the making. I've been trying for at least 2 years now to bring on some expert to speak about the historicity of the Exodus and the archaeology surrounding the Exodus and the conquest. And who better than Dr. David Falk, a professional Egyptologist who speaks about this issue? I've seen debates that he's done, like the Titus Kennedy one on Sean McDowell's. Uh, Recently, yeah, it was controversial, but I thought it was great in terms of the debate itself. Ignoring that, so yeah,
Well,
this.
that debate, that's pretty friendly for an academic debate. People don't realize how vicious those can get.
Oh goodness, yeah, yeah. Well, it's I know in the field of philosophy, people can get pretty vigorous for their opinions and passionate. So yeah, I get what you're talking about. All right, but before we get to that, let's raise some more heat a little bit. But
Of
no, so
course. Why not?
so just for the fans who don't know, I had David on my show before, and believe it or not, it had nothing to do with his expertise as an Egyptologist, but I wanted to get his take on the Shroud of Turin because, as fans know, I'm sort of an amateur expert. I host my Shroud Wars episodes and stuff like that, and David is coming from a skeptical position. So I just wanted to kind of throw it open to you for first thing. After coming out of that show, like how have you felt? I know I gave you some papers to look at from Stirp's side of things and stuff. Has anything changed? Are you pretty much in the same boat?
Well, I mean, I'm not really that skeptical about it. For me, I take a middle position on it anyway. I'm not saying it's a forgery. Definitely not saying it's a forgery. I'm saying it's a misidentified artifact. So I don't take that sort of extreme view on it either way. I'm not a Shroud supporter. I'm not somebody who says it's a forgery. I think there's a middle position there. I did read the articles you did send me, and really didn't move the needle that much for me, in all honesty.
Fair enough. So you still kind of think it's some kind of painting or artwork of a
I
business.
think it's still think I still think it's a man-made artifact, yes,
Gotcha.
but I don't think it's a forgery.
Fair enough. Yep, I remember you made the distinction there. So okay, all right, fair enough. Well, I thank you so much for at least giving the articles a read and then giving your
Mhm.
honest take. So yeah,
Well, I always find the articles interesting to read. That's, I believe, as I say, in exposing myself to all points of view.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. And these papers, they're not just like young earth creationist stuff. This is like
Mhm.
applied optics,
Mhm.
Canadian Forensic Science Journal. So yeah, yeah. All right. Well, with that said, I do want to kind of go into today's topic because obviously, like I said, the Exodus and the historicity of the Exodus is something that I've been interested in for a long time. So I think the place to start is obviously with our historical sources. And
Mhm.
when it comes to the Exodus, the main primary sources definitely are going to be the biblical sources with regarding the specific events of the Exodus. So I'm just kind of curious when it comes to the book of Exodus and the biblical sources themselves, what do you think about the dating of the sources, the authorship of those sources? Can we tie it to a historical Moses and that sort of thing? As well about the conquests in the book of Joshua and that sort of thing. So what's the evidence we have on that front?
Okay, that's like three questions right there. And when we talk about the sources, it's really difficult because most of our sources are going to date to sometime close to the first century, first, second century BC. So most of our sources are much, much later than the originals, as it were. Now, this makes dating the sources very tricky. Makes it very tricky because we don't have a lot of comparative material to make those judgments. The oldest fragment of a biblical text we have is the Ketef Hinnon phylacteries. These are these little silver scrolls, and they date to about the 7th century BC. What's so interesting about these is it provides evidence that the Torah existed prior to the Babylonian exile. So it's during the period of the divided monarchy when those were created. So that shows us that there was a Torah that was quite early. So now that's sort of one way to view this is just through the texts that we have. We also can look at, say, other things like what would have been plausible contemporary knowledge or circles of knowledge. You know, what stuff could they have only known at certain periods of time? And I think if you use that sort of internal evidence, you can pretty much sort of nail, say, at least the original, say, core documents of the Pentateuch down to as early as the 13th century.
Gotcha. 13. Okay, great. Yeah, because I know when I was looking at stuff, like I know some people point out that hey, there's certain internal features, like the
Yeah,
they get certain details that only could have been known if the book was written at that time in the 13th century BC
yeah.
or earlier. As well
We
as
also see too some say transition of say loanwords as well. That also helps to nail it down. Like for example, we see a particular word used, Egyptian loanword, that sort of ceased being used in the 18th dynasty. So the fact we find this sort of trail off and then all of a sudden appear in these documents says that okay, it couldn't be much later than Dynasty 19 because that word fell out of use.
gotcha. And it's not like today where it's like thee and thy or something like that. Like, oh, it's a fad. We'll start reusing these words. It didn't work that way in
Yeah,
ancient Egypt. Okay.
it's more akin to like someone interjecting today. Forsooth,
Awesome, awesome. Okay, and what else apart from the language? What are some of the examples of these like historical details or aspects that again indicate it only could have been written at this very early time?
probably the most compelling evidence is the toponyms, the place names. Those
Gotcha.
are very compelling evidence for when we would expect this to be written. There's also certain terminology that comes into, like for example, um, we'll get to the more to the toponyms, but stuff like the term pharaoh. That's a term that's coined during the reign of Tutmosis III. Okay, prior to that, that term was never used of the king. So the term pharaoh shows us that all these documents have to be at least that that sort of 1450s or later. Likewise, the toponyms show us that the situation that the Israelites found themselves in was pegged to that um that reign those reigns of Seti the first or Ramses the second. So those place names can't be any earlier than the 19th dynasty.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Okay, perfect. Yeah, and I was gonna ask a follow-up on the Pharaoh thing, but yeah, never mind on that. I think a good question at this point. What about the authorship? You've kind of spoken towards the dating, but how do we know can we establish Exodus was written by Moses or that Joshua compiled the book of Joshua and stuff like that? Or
Um, in the case in it's much more murky for Joshua than I would say it is for say Mosaic authorship. Now, we know that the entire Pentateuch was not written by Moses. We know that already because there's a death scene of Moses at the end of Deuteronomy. So he's not writing his own death scene. There's also sort of connecting verses between some of the documents too. Like Moses wrote this, and it just says what he said. So it looks like that there was a core set of documents that were basically compiled together to form the Pentateuch. So it doesn't seem to have been written like a continuous narrative. It looks more like it's a set of documents that were then edited, possibly by Joshua and his scribes into a continuous narrative.
Yeah, gotcha. Because that's what I was gonna with the next question. And it relates to the word pharaoh. And I know some people will say, well, look, obviously later on they remembered what it was, so they were using the older language or something, kind of like how they changed a seer into a prophet and stuff like that. So the skeptics are kind of bringing in the thesis that, like, yeah, we had maybe the evidence you're pointing to that points towards an early date is indicative that parts of the sources date earlier, but then there are other parts that, yeah, they date to the first millennium BC and stuff like that through these later authors and editors and stuff like that. And obviously, you've heard of the documentary hypothesis, which has
Mhm.
been thoroughly refuted at this point. But I just want
Yeah, it's only still in fashion in North America.
to, that's true. Well, maybe in America. I'm in Canada, so maybe we're a little more.
I'm in Canada too.
Oh, goodness. Okay, I didn't know that. Whereabouts?
Vancouver.
Vancouver. Okay, yeah, Toronto on my end here. So, but yeah, but obviously with the documentary hypothesis, there are revisions to that, right? There's been the new one, and then I think a
Oh,
third.
there's been dozens of revisions to the documentary hypothesis, but the core, the sort of the idea of the documentary hypothesis that there were essentially four schools of redactors. The famous J, P, E, and D. Okay, but the earliest of those redactors dates to 950 BC, and the latest are Persian period. At least that's the argument. So I don't think it's very credible myself. And I also don't think it's very useful. I think as a um hypothesis that sort of strove its goal was to help us to discover the origins of the biblical texts and to explain the biblical text, it does neither of those well. My primary beef against the documentary hypothesis is it does incredible violence to the literary genres and literary devices that we find scattered throughout the Pentateuch.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I don't think there is much stock in the documentary hypothesis or much of the revisions. Yeah,
Yeah,
there's
the revisions don't really help. And really, when you talk about the revisions to the documentary hypothesis, it's really not just, I mean, it's really not the core theory that's being revised. It's how do we identify the various schools of redaction.
yeah.
This is why we have now, say, in some of these revisions, we have D1, D2, D3, D4.
Yeah, yeah.
Because the criteria to determine which school is redacting it is constantly changing. Because all of that criteria doesn't work.
Right. Now, apart from, because obviously the main arguments they have, as you said, you find it unconvincing on your end, and it's a lot of linguistic type argumentation. But I'm just curious, if you were to argue for that position, what do you think is the best evidence they have that would indicate a very late date for at least portions of these sources, and how, why do you still not find that those convincing?
Well, the best argument I think they have is the agricultural laws as they move into the promised land. That's probably the best evidence they got. But there's nothing saying that all of those agricultural laws were necessarily instituted by Moses anyway. So that's kind of a tempest in a teapot kind of argument. So again, does this help me to interpret the text? No, not in the slightest. But you could make an argument, I think, that there were some of those agricultural laws that were written quite late. That you could probably make an argument for. But that also doesn't dismantle the whole concept of Mosaic authorship either. I think you can establish a sound presence of a Mosaic authorship just on the book of Exodus. You could even make a really good case that Genesis had Mosaic authorship. You know, Numbers also. Okay, now once you get into Deuteronomy, things get a little iffy. Okay, but Deuteronomy's kind of a strange book anyway.
Yeah, yeah. Second giving of the law again.
Yeah,
Uh, okay.
Deuteronomos, second law.
There you go. It's all in the name, right?
It's in the name. Yep.
All right. So let me ask, kind of switch gears and ask you about the historical background. So this is something maybe I've missed it, but I haven't heard in a lot of your interviews. You get into kind of the start of the Exodus period, where how on earth did the Israelites arrive in Egypt? Obviously, from the Bible, we know about the story of Joseph and all of
Mhm.
that. I'm just kind of, do you think that there is some good secular historical evidence for the Joseph narrative in Genesis? And I know that the Hyksos, some people posit that the Hyksos are this Semitic group initiating I think it's the second intermediate period. You can correct me if that's wrong, but they usually connect Joseph with the Hyksos. I've seen some connection with that and the Israelites' arrival. So what's your take on the arrival of the Israelites in Egypt and its relation to Joseph there?
Okay, well, I think we have to understand that that area of Goshen, which is the area surrounding the cities of Avaris and Paramses. Okay, it's that sort of region of the Nile Delta. That had been the result of several waves of Semitic migration. The first wave of Semitic migration took place in the first intermediate period. And that's when the Amorites arrive in Egypt. And they're going to be the people that, out of which we get the Hyksos. Okay. And Hyksos just is an Egyptian word meaning foreign rulers. That's what it means. Okay. Now, Joseph, he's going to arrive during the second wave of Semitic migration. And that happens during the second intermediate period. At that point, in the beginning of the 15th dynasty, the Hyksos have already established their kingdom. They're already in charge of a good chunk of Egypt, from basically the Nile Delta all the way south to Thebes. At that point, they are extracting tribute out of the king of Thebes. So, so there's already a fully established kingdom, and the capital city is at Avaris when Joseph arrives. And we know roughly when Joseph arrives. He arrives a little after 1666 BC. That's the beginning of the 15th dynasty. It also coincides with um, the introduction of the chariot to Egypt. As we see in Genesis that in two occasions, Joseph uses a chariot. You didn't have the chariot before the 15th dynasty. So that's a very, very good sort of bookend for when we can start to date Joseph.
And I'm not sure if you covered that. I remember seeing there was like an archaeological discovery of it was of the Hyksos, I believe, where they had the multicolored coats, and there's like a Egyptian hieroglyphs of that.
Yeah, there's just two sort of discoveries in regards to this. There's a 12th dynasty, I'm sorry, early 13th dynasty, a statue which shows a varicolored tunic being worn by a Hyksos prince, a local Semitic prince. There's also the Beni Hassan painting, which shows Semites entering into Egypt wearing these varicolored tunics. The varicolored tunics does not seem to be special to Joseph. It just seems to be a feature of Semitic culture. So, and we also know that those people portrayed at the Beni Hassan painting aren't Israelites. In fact, there's even a little inscription on that and a little sheet of papyrus that being drawn on it that says that they're miners. They're there to mine minerals and basically sell them back to the Egyptians.
And just a,
So
oh, sorry. Go ahead.
go on.
Just when does that second source date from? Even though it has nothing to do with it.
It dates to the reign of Khnumhotep II, who was a nomarch in the Oryx nome. Okay. So he's a regional governor. He's a hereditary regional governor. And he dates to, I believe the reign of Senwosret III.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. All right. So here's a question you're gonna think I'm stupid and stuff like that, but there
No.
are radical skeptics out there that are look, there are Jesus mythicists out there. There are also Moses mythicists out there, and they'll
Oh yeah.
claim that Moses in particular is a complete myth, that there's no evidence. And if you don't mind, I just want to play a short little clip from someone I think you'll get a chuckle out of. She's a radical skeptic, Francesca Strova Pomako.
Yep, I'm familiar with her.
Okay, so I just want to play a short little clip of her saying that, yeah, Moses didn't exist. It's foolish to believe in a historical Moses. Um, is that showing up there?
First off, who wrote it and when?
Some people think that Moses wrote it, which he didn't because Moses didn't exist. So then you have to think, well, who did write it? And it's basically a collection of different authors from centuries and centuries. So probably with the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, you're talking about at least 500 years in the making. With the New Testament, you're talking about probably 150 to 200 years in the making. But basically, it was all written by men with daddy issues.
Apart from her little assessment at the end there, you get the point, right? She starts right
Yeah.
off. Moses didn't exist. I wanted to get, is there any evidence? We do have strong evidence for the historical Jesus. Is there anything like
Mhm.
that for Moses?
We don't have strong direct evidence from Moses, but we wouldn't expect to really either. I mean, he wasn't a major figure in Egyptian culture. So, um, and this is because he wasn't really a prince of Egypt. He was a adopted son of the daughter of a king. Okay. And it's really even that is sort of a retrojective look at his position. Okay. But what we have for Moses here is rather compelling indirect evidence. Now, Kenneth Kitchen noted that if you're going to have an exodus, somebody's got to lead it. Okay. You're not going to have people wandering aimlessly without direction. So if there was an exodus at all, there would have had to have been a charismatic leader of some kind directing it. So there you've got sort of the foundation for a Moses right there. But there's another detail that we find in the biblical text that's really very compelling, which is there's an odd parallel between, say, the narrative of Moses and what we find in the strike papyri of the 20th dynasty. Now, let me explain what happened during the labor strikes of the 20th dynasty. Is essentially you have workers at Deir el Medina, and they're building the king's tombs. Well, their food rations get cut off. They're a sequestered town. They can't go to a market and get more food, so it's got to be brought in for them. So they go on strike. Well, there's this leader, a Magi. So he's not an Egyptian. He's also not royalty, but because he's a Magi, he's in this really unique position that the people trust him. He's a community leader. Also, he has standing in the court of the mayor of Thebes. So he can go and he says, okay, I can bring your grievances to the mayor of Thebes. So he's allowed to just walk into the palace of the mayor of Thebes and make demands. What's really interesting about this is, he says to the strikers, you know, continue working. You don't want to give the king any reason to come in and start crushing skulls. So you keep working, you keep building your tombs, and you protest on your half day off, which you would have gotten off anyway. So the king wouldn't be denied any of his labor. Okay, so then this really gets interesting because what happens is the Magi goes to the mayor of Thebes and he says to the mayor of Thebes, okay, look, you can either give the workers their rations, their demands, or I will jump rank and I will take their redress to the vizier, your boss.
Yep.
Now, what we see then is so he says, okay, you won't if you don't play ball with me, you'll play ball with the guy upstairs. Okay. Moses does something very, very similar. He tells the people to continue making mud bricks, to keep making your quota. And then he goes to Pharaoh and he says, okay, look, you can let the people go worship in the desert, or I'll go up one step up. I'll go to your boss, who is God. It's the same strategy that is used, but like 100 years earlier. So we find these really stark comparisons between the labor protest movements of the 20th dynasty and the Exodus narrative. It's really uncanny that you have sort of the same sort of interaction being played on both ends. So so I think that's compelling internal evidence that not only do we have an explanation for, why Moses would exist, but why he would have to have the necessary background he does have. Because you just can't walk into the court of the king. You have to have standing. The only way you can have standing is to be a member of the royal family. This is why the adoption of Moses is also so important. This labor protest also shows us the justification for him being adopted into the royal family, because it gives him one right and only one right, which is an audience with the king.
Sure, perfect. Yeah, yeah. And I was just going to clarify the 20th dynasty is that where they're in the third intermediate period, or are they still in
No,
the?
no, this is before this. You're still in the New Kingdom.
Okay, okay, got it. All right, cool. So obviously, as that question indicates, now we come to the fun bit, dating the Exodus. So yeah, I was telling David before we started the show, back 2 years ago when I first wanted someone like David Falk to come on, I wouldn't say it was hardcore, but I was pretty passionate about taking the Associates for Biblical Research. I remember being impressed with Brian Wood's work on Jericho and and stuff like that, and the work on the Exodus. So I liked taking the traditional date in the 1400s. Obviously, David Falk takes the 1200s, around the time of Ramses the Great, as being, along with the majority of scholars, in all honesty, as the dating for Exodus. But the first question I wanted to ask before we get into that controversy between Christians and stuff like that, look, there are skeptics that date the Exodus even earlier than traditional Christians, and I think you when you were on Inspiring Philosophy, you were talking about some people who date the Exodus to the time of the end of the Middle Kingdom, so when those Hyksos were first coming in. So yeah, if you want to kind of respond, what's that theory about? Why do you disagree with it? But also, oh, okay, yeah, we'll take it one at a time, one at a time. So
It
that,
helps.
yeah, sure. So what do you make of those guys?
Okay, let's back up on one point that you made in the question here, which is the difference between, say, the traditional date and the late date. You got it backwards. Okay? The early date is not the traditional date. The late date is the traditional date. The early date never existed as a theory until 1906, when it was coined as a new theory by James Orr. It's actually the younger theory. The traditional date is actually the late date. So, but it, because of who coined it, it gained a lot of traction amongst, say, fundamentalists and evangelicals in the early 20th century. So people kind of forget where these things sort of originate from. So it's better to call this early date versus late date rather than traditional date versus any other, because people really don't have a good grip on what is tradition and how old traditions are. So the late date is the older view. It's actually much older. Okay. But with that said, let's talk about that.
You mind if I
Yeah,
just very quickly, just
sure.
because that's new to me. I didn't know that. So, out of curiosity, like how did the first of all, how far back does the later traditional date go back? Like who and how did the ancients like how did they determine that it was this later date back then? Because I thought the
Okay.
Bible's yeah. Right.
Well, when we talk about dating of these things, you've got to be careful about, keeping your theory straight. Now, in the case of the late date, it dates back to the 1850s with a guy by the name of C.R. Lepsius. Okay. So it's a good 60 years older than the early date. Okay. Now, there have been other views that look like the early date, but aren't the early date, like Usher's chronology. Okay. And and that goes back to to the time of Scaliger. Okay. But that's your early modern period. But even before then, there's a version of the late date that goes back to the 4th century AD by Rabbi Hanasi. Okay. In both cases, like the Usher date and, say, the Hanasi date, both of those are sort of, how do I say this? They're theories that don't look anything like our modern equivalents of the early and the late date. They're different views and different theories, and they're based on different hypotheses and underlying suppositions. So we have to be very, very careful not to mix up our theories then. Okay. So, but for most people, they will look at, say, the early date and go, oh, it's been around since Usher, 1446, 1491, not that far apart, until you sort of tease out what those theories actually try to communicate and how they arrived at their conclusions. They're totally different. So we got to be very careful about how we assess chronology and how these theories were built up. That makes sense?
Yep. Yeah. Thank you so much for that. And yeah, but now you can get to the patterns of evidence thing. But that was just fascinating as a side note 'cause I didn't know that.
Okay.
So,
Okay, so now you were going to ask me a question here about the Exodus Decoded.
first thing you said you wanted to split it up. So I know that in your show on
Okay,
with
what do you want asking me? What are you asking me to answer now?
yeah. So in your show with Inspiring Philosophy, you
Mhm.
guys were talking about the patterns of evidence, which places the Exodus right at the beginning of the Hyksos or at the end of the Middle Kingdom.
Okay, this is David Roll's theory. Yeah, this is
Yes.
David Roll's theory. And it relies on a radical revisionism of chronology. Now, the problem with David Roll's theory is that it ultimately doesn't work. Because one of the things with you got like radical chronology revisions, like David Roll, like Velikovsky, um, is it doesn't take into account associated biographies. Okay. It's not just enough to look at the king's list and try to jigger it around the way you want. There's huge bureaucracies attached to all these kings, and they have their own place and their own roles and their own functions. What happens is when guys like David Roll and Velikovsky, try to crush, reduce the length of the chronology, is you now get overlapping bureaucracies. You get, these people are being buried in the same cemeteries. They're putting their inscriptions on the walls of the same temple. It just breaks down. The theory breaks down so fast. So I think that's no serious archaeologist takes David Roll's work seriously.
Gotcha. Yep. And I totally agree. For what it's worth for me, I concur with that. Now there's also another equally radical skeptical view, and these guys, so this is the Exodus Decoded. It's a documentary by James Cameron and the Israeli Canadian filmmaker Simcha Jacobovici. I don't know. He does a lot of document
Jakobovich.
Jacobovich. Okay, there you go. But they are slightly different. They place the Exodus at the end of the Hyksos period, at the expulsion of the Hyksos during Amhos the First. So this is around 1570 to 1546 BC. So it's about 100 years, 150 years or so before the I, I don't know what to call it now that it's not the traditional date, but yeah, ahead of
Early date.
the early date. Yeah. So what do you make of this documentary and this theory?
Okay, here's I don't like commenting on Exodus Decoded because Yakubovich is a frivolous litigant. Okay.
Okay.
He has had a history of suing scholars who have commented on his work. So we're going to talk about the how the Hyksos, that view that the Hyksos were the Israelites without actually talking about
Gotcha.
his Exodus Decoded. Okay.
Sounds good. Perfect. Yeah, I don't feel like getting sued. So yeah,
No, it's not fun.
I okay.
Okay, so the idea is that when with the expulsion of the Hyksos, these were really the Israelites that fled Egypt and took the wealth of Egypt with them as they fled. Okay. Now, there's sort of two subviews of this idea. Okay. And there's the identity view, which basically says, okay, these are the Hyksos are the Israelites. They walk into Israel and they set up home in Israel. Okay. There's another view that's more of what's called the memorial view, that the Hyksos are not the Israelites, but they take the story of the expulsion with them into Israel. And then the Israelites, the local Israelite Canaanite population, picks up that view as a memory, a false memory of what happened to them. Okay. So those are the two sort of subset views here. Now, almost everyone has now rejected the identity view. And the reason why the identity view is rejected is because none of the details are correct for this to be the Israelite Exodus. The Hyksos, when they leave Egypt, they take the way to the land of the Philistines and the road of Horus, which was what it would be called later on, and they enter into the coastal plain by Gazan and Ashkelon. Whereas, say, the Israelites, they're going to enter Canaan from the east through the Heshbon and Arnon. Okay, and that's between the kingdoms of Ammon and Moab. So they're very there's no geographical sort of point of intersection between them. The Hyksos are entering through the coastal plain near the south. The Israelites are basically going around Edom and Moab and coming in through the east, and crossing the fords of the Jordan. They're also separated by about 300 years. So, that's a significant amount of time as well. So that's why most scholars today are going to reject the identity view. Now, there's still scholars out there that accept the memorial view, that basically that the Hyksos, ran to Israel, but they're not related to the Israelites, and that the Israelites picked up that view from the retelling of the Hyksos tale. I think over time that view is going to start to diminish as more and more evidence for the archaeology here comes out. So I don't think it's already a view. The memorial view is already a view in decline, but I think there's still some people who hold it.
Awesome. Awesome. All right. Thank you so much. So yeah, so kind of going into the more mainstream debate. This is what your bread and butter is about. This is what you're typically seen debating is this issue between the 1400s, the early date, and then the late date, the times of Ramses the Great, around
Mm-hmm.
1270 BC. So maybe let's do it this way. Let's split it up. So In terms of the evidence for the early date, the 1400s BC, what do you see as the evidence for it and the evidence against it? And what's your take on all of that positive and negative evidence for that date?
I think their best piece of evidence by and far is going to be First Kings 6:1. And they're going to double down on a certain interpretation of First Kings 6:1, which is in the 480th year of the Exodus. Um, Solomon builds his temple. Okay, that's going to be that's their crowning piece of evidence right there. And they're going to sort of double down on a literal reading of that date to basically prop up the 1446 date. Most of the other evidence is not very good, to be very honest. Okay, that's their most compelling argument.
Just to clarify, before you move on, the
Mhm.
date of the building of Solomon's temple, I thought all sides agreed. Is that around 966 BC
Yeah,
or
966, 967.
okay? Okay, cool. So all sides agree
Yeah,
on that.
all sides agree on that. That's not a point of controversy.
Okay,
How we read that 480th year, that's very controversial.
gotcha.
And it's been a controversial for a long time. And part of it is because it's one of those weird, how do I say this, idiomatic numbers. There's some numbers in Israelite, like we have idiomatic numbers too. Lucky number 7, unlucky 13. We have these sort of numbers. Every culture has these sort of idiomatic expressions expressed as numbers. We know the difference between 911 and 911. We know intuitively that there's a difference between those two numbers just by how they're pronounced. You know, when you say it's a 911 moment, just telling someone that's an emergency. If you're saying it's a 911 moment, you're saying it's a catastrophe. So we have these idiomatic expressions using numbers in our old culture. Well, the Israelites did too. Particularly certain numbers like 7, 12, and 40. Very, very, like 7 is the number of perfection. 12 is the number of completeness. 12 tribes, 12 apostles, etc. And you also have 40, which is for an indefinite period of time. So with the 480, you've got 12 times 40. And this has been noted by the likes of Umberto Cassuto since the 1960s. So this is not a surprise to anyone. This has been known for a long time. So you're going to get that tension in the interpretation of 1 Kings 6:1, where you get one side insisting that this has to be a literal number, and they'll come up with some pretty bad arguments for justifying that. But you also get the other side too saying, hey, we've got evidence that in temple dedication inscriptions, idiomatic numbers were sometimes used, like in the temple of Elishuma, where you have 720, just 12 times 60, 60 being their equivalent of that indefinite expression of time. So, it's one of those things where you're just going to, you know, there's going to be that sort of tension between rival interpretations for that one key verse. But it's the best they've got.
Just kind of curious with so you said it is 12 times 40. So it does match this pattern. I'm just kind of curious, are there ever times in the Bible, provable times in the Bible where a number does match these idiomatic things, but it is meant to be interpreted literally?
Oh, yeah.
And is there a
Oh, yeah.
way
But
to
this is the thing here. When we do find this, it comes down, how do we interpret this? This is always the question. How do we interpret these idiomatic expressions? If the context says, hey, it's literal, then you should interpret it literally. If the context says it's idiomatic, then yeah, you interpret idiomatically. But we aren't always told by context which one it is. Sometimes the author just expects us to be comfortable with that ambiguity. Like, for example, there's several places where it probably isn't a literal number, but we're just not told that it's not a literal number. Like, for example, you have the reign of King Saul, 40 years. King David, 40 years. King Solomon, 40 years. Wait a minute, three kings in a row that reigned exactly 40 years? Okay, that's probably that they weren't doing proper record keeping, so they were just putting in that idiomatic placeholder for that. We see the same thing at the beginning of, say, the Book of Judges, where you have, say, the times of peace being 40 or a multiple of 40 for the same reason.
Okay. And with respect to this text in First Kings 6, I believe
Mhm.
you said, right? Is there anything in the context that indicates one way or the other, or is this one of the cases that's ambiguous? Because one thing I'm noticing, I just out of curiosity, 'cause I think you also said three is another one of these idiomatic numbers. It also means
Seven. Yeah, 7, 12, and 40.
okay. Is three not one of them? I
Nope,
remember.
three's not one of them.
Okay, so I learned wrong then. So never mind, because I was going to say that it does talk about this in the fourth year of Solomon's reign. So it's using the number four.
Yeah, that's a regnal
That,
date. That's probably literal.
okay,
You know,
so
because regnal dates are usually literal. Okay, but we've also have, as I say, examples of this in other ancient Near Eastern literature where idiomatic dates are being used when referenced to an epoch.
okay,
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 so it's in reference to, and frankly, almost none of these. I have not found one yet that references the epoch in a literal fashion. There's always some sort of numerology or idiomatic expression going on.
gotcha. Okay, so that makes sense. So the kind of the contextual indicator is when it's talking about like regnal years, those typically tend to be literal, where when it's talking about numbers related to epochs or you
Yeah.
know, that's okay. Okay, that makes sense. All right. So and with that said, apart from that one biblical argument, you don't think there's any other evidence that they think is good, like either secular or archaeological, that they can use to establish this date?
I've heard various arguments. In fact, I had a whole video of 20 different arguments that they used, and I don't think any of them are very good. Okay, so you know, um, I mean, they're like they'll often say, look, talk about Judges 11 and Jephthah and the 300 years where Jephthah says to the king of Ammon, well, 300 years, we've been here, but you haven't taken back the land. Okay. The problem is that particular letter that Jephthah writes to the king of Ammon is kind of a comedy of errors. He makes several historical mistakes in those letters, not the least of which being that they did try to take it back just one chapter ago in Judges 10. Okay. So, you know, when you've got a sort of impeached witness like this, you can't take the facts at face value. You can't take what's being said at face value. He gets like, for example, he gets the god of the Ammonites wrong. He says, your god Chemosh gave you your land. Well, Chemosh wasn't god of the Ammonites. Chemosh was the god of the Moabites.
Yeah.
So he makes a lot of errors in that letter. So, when they try to use the 300 years as evidence, you just can't take that for face value. I mean, he gets everything else wrong, and you expect this to get right. But then again, that's sort of the tension that the biblical authors put upon us. How do you deal with an unreliable witness? Even if he's working on behalf of God. These are questions that the text raises that we as readers are expected to wrestle with and engage, not just take it at face value.
Gotcha. So sorry, I was trying to look up Bart Ehrman kind of thing because he also mentions that. But all right, I think you've answered that for the 1400s. I want to switch gears to the date you actually take then around the 1270 BC or thereabouts.
1265, but
Okay,
out there. His
12.
25th regnal year.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, I remember you talking about. Okay, so what is the evidence, either biblical or secular or archaeological, whatever you want, to that you think supports this as the actual date of the Exodus?
Okay, several things. First of all, we have, as we've mentioned already, the toponyms. Almost all the toponyms in the Exodus route are specific to either the reigns of Seti I or Ramses II. Okay. Like, for example, the source city of Ramses. That is the city of Pir-Ramses. It is, and it's specifically named after Ramses II, and we know that from Papyrus Anastasi III. Uh, the city of Pithom is comes from the Egyptian Per Atum. Okay, that's where we get Pithom from. And it was renamed that by Ramses II. But more importantly, the Israelites are credited with building both Ramses and Pithom. So, in the case of Ramses, there was no city there prior to a royal residence by Seti the First. Okay, and Seti the First was Ramses II's father. So, if if the Israelites didn't build the storage cities at Ramses, then they're being basically ascribed of having done labor they didn't do. And I think that's a problem. But there's also the fortress of Migdol that was built by Seti the First. Okay, there wasn't a fortress there prior to Seti the First. We also have towns that are clearly Ramesside, like Baal Safon and Pihahirot. All of those are in that context of the early to mid 19th dynasty. Second off, we also have on the other end, we have the appearance of the Israelites in the land of Canaan around 1217 in the Merneptah victory stela. And it's shortly after that, in the mid 12th century, that Israelite settlements start to appear in Canaan. And almost every archaeologist agrees on this. Okay, mid 12th century is when we see just Israelite settlements just pop up, as if they're, I mean, right, just like mushrooms. They're popping up all over Canaan at that point. Okay, and even guys like Deaver will agree on this one. Okay, so that sort of gives you the earmark of when we can start expecting to see when is the conquest taking place. We also have the abandonment of Avaris. That's mid Dynasty 19. The Semitic population remains at Avaris essentially until that point, in which case, at that point, the entire city except for the port is abandoned. The Amarna letters show us the context in the 14th century, but this is sort of the time between, say, the early and the late Exodus. But what the Amarna letters show us is a Levant that's controlled by the Amorite Confederacy that's expanding. These are the same Amorites that the Israelites are going to fight and break up that confederacy in the first 5 years of the conquest. So the Amorites are taking over land, hand over fist, during that 14th century. But if this had been, say, the early Exodus date, well, that confederacy should have already been broken up and Hatzor already destroyed. We see Hatzor still a thriving city in the mid 14th century. We also have to compare, say, the destructions of, say, Hatzor versus Jericho. Now, for Jericho, we have two destruction layers, okay, essentially. There's a mid 16th century destruction layer, and then there's a late Bronze to be roughly 1220 BC destruction. Hatzor, we only have one major destruction layer there that sort of ended the city, which is also a late 13th century. So, you compare Hatzor, the stratigraphic records of Hatzor and Jericho, And there's only one place where they match, and that is in the late 13th century. So that would be consistent with a late Exodus date. So,
Okay. All right. But what about on the other end? Because I know that there have been certain negative evidences that people have both skeptic and those who go for the early date have
mhm.
offered, right? So for example, I've the hyper skeptics will say, but there is no evidence of the wanderings anywhere at this time or something like that. They'll point to well, if Ramses is the Pharaoh of the Exodus, what we know of his life doesn't fit with the Pharaoh of the Exodus in various ways. So
Ways.
well, I think one of the thing was about like, oh, his firstborn son needed to die. I know that was an issue that,
Amenhotep Kopchef.
uh, yeah, yeah, okay, and
Ramses had 13, 12 of his firstborns die. Okay, his designated inheritors. We have to remember that Merneptah was the 13th in line to the throne. He wasn't first, not by a long shot. Ramses lived so long that most of his sons predeceased him. Okay, but in the case of, say, Amenhotep Kopchef, we don't exactly know how he died because we didn't get the whole body. In fact, we don't even know if that skull is his. There's some speculation that that skull that they found in KV5 was Amenhotep Kopchef's, but we've got no guarantee. It's just a skull. It's just a skull of a male. Could it be Amenhotep Kopchef? Could be. It could be some unlucky poor guy that got thrown in there, at a later date. That's possible too. It's also possible that it could be also one of Ramses II's other sons, you know, because frankly, Amenhotep Kopchef was 25 at the time of his death. So, he's 25, you know, he could have had younger brothers, who were maybe 23 or 24 who also died. So we don't exactly know. I mean, Ramses II had 52 sons. That's a lot of kids.
yeah,
And there's just too many uncertainties here to try to pin the cause of death basically on the potential of a head trauma on a skull that we can't even positively identify.
gotcha. Okay. The other thing I know how you're going to answer this, but I've heard some people mentioning that. Well, what about the death of Ramses? Like we still have, like it's kind of assumed that doesn't the Exodus say he drowned in the Red Sea and stuff like that? Like he was killed when they're along with his soldiers and stuff like that. So
No,
in that rule it. Okay.
the Bible doesn't claim he drowned. It's part of, it's been in court. This idea that the Pharaoh drowned in the Red Sea is part of Islamic theology. It's also part of, they say, the Jewish Seder, but there's actually no evidence from the Bible that Pharaoh drowned in the Sea of Reeds. It's, in fact, if anything, the Bible makes no statement as to what was the fate of the king. Now, even early daters will say the king of the Exodus didn't drown in the Red Sea. They'll even say this just because it's a misinterpretation of the Psalms. It's a misinterpretation where, God says that he swept away Pharaoh and his chariots. Okay. But Pharaoh wasn't, it doesn't say he drowned. Traditional renderings of that text, traditional readings of that text will sometimes interpret it as drowning, but the text doesn't actually say that.
Assumption. Yeah. Yeah.
It's an assumption. It's eisegesis. You're reading something into the text.
Oh, fair enough. All right, cool. I think that covers it in terms of my questions about the dating and the reasons for and against. So I want to ask about the historical authenticity of specific narratives and events related to the Exodus. And on that front, my first question, radical skeptics have tried to dismiss the Exodus narratives as first millennium inventions and interpolations. I think we've kind of answered that a lot. Um, but I'm just kind of curious, what reasons or evidence do we have to support the historicity of certain specific narratives? So, for example, Moses. Do you want me to go one at a time, or
Let's go one at a time.
Okay, so let's start with Moses's famous birth and his adoption into the royal family of the
Mhm.
Egyptian pharaohs. Do we have any reason to think that would be historical, or is that all myth?
We have if if we had to depend on an early Exodus date, we'd have a problem here. Okay? Because one of the things about daughters of the king is that they were not allowed to adopt children. In Egyptian society, women adopting children was seen as almost an absolute right. Women could adopt children on their own initiative without asking their husbands. They didn't need to ask. They could just do it. Now, with that said, there were two classes of women who couldn't adopt. Uh, Women who were slaves couldn't adopt, and daughters of the king couldn't adopt. And there's various reasons why that is. It's a security concern. It's these are women who are going to be, say, shipped off as treaty wives potentially to other, say, um, Egyptian nobles. Okay, so they were used as pawns in political marriage. Okay, so there was really compelling reason why they prevented daughters of the king from adopting. Now, in the case of, say, the late Exodus, this is not a problem. And the reason why is because at that time, there's several changes in dynasties. As you know, King Tut had no heirs. Okay. His predecessor, Semenkare, had no heirs. The guy who replaced King Tut, King Ai, he had no children. He had two sons, but they predeceased him. Okay. Horemheb had no children. So what ultimately happened was Ramses the first, General Ramses, a commoner, gets elevated to the throne. Okay. But Ramses the first isn't arriving alone. He's got a large family. Ramses the second was already born at the time when his grandfather took the throne. His daughters, Ramses the first's daughters, would have had the right to adopt up to the point where their father became king. And they would have had that absolute right to adopt. So it's one of those really rare situations in Egyptian history where a daughter of a king could adopt because she wasn't yet daughter of the king. It's only after Moses is forced to flee that Ramses the first becomes elevated to the throne. Moses leaves Egypt sometime during the reign of Horemheb. And that's sort of consistent with Horemheb's character, too. He's a real law and order guy. He hates corruption. He hates nobles getting away with murder. Yeah, it totally makes sense that Horemheb would want to seek basically a misbehaving noble's life. Okay. And Ramses the First, as vizier of Lower Egypt under Horemheb, would still have not been in any position to protect his adopted grandson, just because of the mood of the king. So we also have to realize too that when we take a look at that birth narrative, it's also a recapitulation. It's sort of a parabolic act. And I think this is one of those sort of fine details here that people often miss, is Moses is placed among the reeds, and he's drawn out of the reeds. He is saved from being killed by traveling through the reeds. This is going to be recapitulated later on when the people of Israel pass through the Sea of Reeds. It's a really interesting piece of text. That birth narrative there is not just for window dressing. It's not just to give Moses street cred. It's to give you a hint in Moses' own life, what's going to happen later on. So it's a reminder to the reader that you're going to see this again, not just as, say, the life of Moses, but the salvation through the reeds.
Gotcha. There's that parallel there that you're arguing for and stuff. Okay,
Mhm.
well, before we get to the Red Sea, though, you're kind of skipping a very important series of events, the 10 plagues, and this is something that fascinated me from multiple angles, even going back to I remember when I was like a kid in Sunday school, my Sunday school teacher kind of presenting like Ron Wyatt type stuff, where it's like, oh, we've
Oh dear.
found the chariot wheels in the Red Sea, and
Oh no.
we've got the, but yeah, coming at it from
That
an
was such a bad forgery.
yeah, I've renounced that. I will admit that. Even
No, no chariot wheel ever looked like that. Ever.
yeah, yeah,
It would
but
be a one heck of a bad ride, too.
yep, it would definitely not be fun. A bumpy ride for sure. But let's put the Ron Wyatts to the side. I'm asking you here as a professional Egyptologist. Is there any secular evidence or archaeological evidence or anything that can establish the historicity of the 10 plagues that you think is actually some good evidence on a balance of probabilities, let's say?
I think there's one piece of good evidence. Um, Now we have to understand that the 10 plagues are agricultural blights. Okay. Most of them are only going to hit you for a season, and these plagues are not back to back. They're happening over a period of 3 to 6 months during the inundation cycle. Okay, so they're over a stretch of time, but they're typically agricultural blights. And the problem with agricultural blights is they don't leave evidence because okay, all the barley gets smashed. Okay, uh, that's bad for beer. Okay, that's real bad for beer. But the next year, your crops are replaced by the next growth of the crops. So it's really hard to look at stuff like agricultural blights and try to pin it down because you're just not going to, things are just don't work that way when you're dealing with agricultural blights. But there is one exception to this, which is in Exodus 10:15, when the locusts kill the trees. They strip off, they eat everything. The locusts eat all the greenery on the trees and they kill the trees. Okay. Now, unlike most agricultural blights, trees are incredibly hard to replace. It takes generations to restore trees because they're slow growing. They don't come back up in a single season. So, what you have then is in Dynasty 20, you start to get a wood shortage. Okay. People, and we see this in, say, the reuse of coffins and funerary furniture, where people can't get wood anymore to make coffins. They've run out. No more trees, no more wood, no new coffins. So you got to take Uncle George's coffin, chuck the body out, and put dear old dad who just died into that coffin and reuse it. So we see this sort of reuse of coffins en masse at, say, the end of the 20th dynasty and into the 21st dynasty. So that indicates that there was sort of some reason that they ran out of wood. So, and I think the best explanation for that would be, say, the locusts that did come in and say destroyed the trees. Now that would lead to a glut of wood for a while because you could always harvest the trunks. But once you run out of those trunks, there's nothing to replace them.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So that is very interesting. Yeah, that was another thing I remember in my old Sunday school. Like I think that she taught us that there was a source mentioning some of the 10 plagues, like a later Egyptian source talking about it or something like that. I don't know if you.
There's you got the Ippaware papyrus that talks about, say, the river turning to blood. You also have the sun darkening in Nefertiti, but these are actually earlier sources, much earlier sources. These are Middle Kingdom sources. So they don't apply to the Exodus. They actually long predate the Exodus.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Okay. Now just before I move on, I am kind of curious. This is not on my list, but there is a
Mhm.
moral dimension that I had with when I used to work with an atheist co-host. And I'm just kind of curious as to your take on the morality of the 10 plagues. That God, they compared it to like this is cruel and unusual punishment. I'm just kind of asking you to put your ethics hat on. Do you think that God either causing or allowing the 10 plagues to happen in Egypt, does that amount to cruel and unusual punishment in your view, and therefore God is immoral? Or how would you answer an atheist who says that?
Well, I'm not a moral philosopher, so just take this with the proverbial pinch of salt, okay?
Yep.
I don't think that this was cruel or unusual in any way, okay? Um, they were held there against their will. They were enslaved through essentially conquest, okay? So, the Israelites were invited guests into Egypt. They were allowed to stay there. They were allowed to live in the land. And then the Theban 17th dynasty conquered Avaris. And when they conquered Avaris, they enslaved the population. So, and in some ways, everyone benefited from this who was not an Israelite. Okay. Because the whole thing that those storage cities, we have to understand that those storage cities are used to store food. They're used to store food because this is a barter economy. So what they would do is for the temples of Egypt, they didn't store money because they didn't have money, but they would store food, tons and tons and tons of food. So they need these vast storage silos, and you can go see them at the Ramesseum today in West Thebes. They just kept massing all this food, and what would happen is that food would then be given to they would make their little offerings. They would take that food, give it to the priests, and then the priests would sell it to the other castes in society. So these storage silos were the sort of the food distribution mechanism of the entire country. So when we talk about, okay, maybe the slave on the street, who wasn't an Israelite, he didn't have any involvement. Well, he did get some benefit from the Israelites' labor. The whole society got benefit through the labor because it was part of the food distribution system.
Gotcha. All right. All right. So let's move on to your favorite part, the parting of the Red Sea. And you've kind of addressed this, but what, if any, is the historical evidence that a secular Egyptologist might take as plausible for proving that?
Oh, easy. It's a wind set down. We have lots of evidence today for wind set downs. There's been several scientific papers done on these. We do know they occur in the eastern portion of the Nile, where the Sea of Reeds would have been located. It would have been located in, say, the Pelusiac estuary. That's those lakes there were between 20 and 40 feet deep. A wind set down of about 50 miles an hour could have easily parred them. That's a well-established phenomenon these days.
Gotcha. Okay, so this is in the Sea of Reeds, not like the Red Sea proper type deal.
Yeah, yeah, it's not the Red Sea proper. It's the Yam Suf, Sea of Reeds.
Gotcha.
That's what it says in the Hebrew.
Okay, so the argument, just to clarify, it's kind of it's not an argument directly proving the event, but it's establishing the plausibility, like
Yeah,
the
it's the plausibility of the event. I mean, there's no question that they still get wind sit downs in the Eastern Nile today. Still get them. It's not
gotcha,
a common event, but it does happen from time to time. And it can raise the elevation of water dramatically.
gotcha. Yep, yep. All right, fair enough. And yep, you're absolutely right on that. Okay, and the final major aspect is the wilderness wanderings. My goodness, I hear all the time that there's no evidence at all for any wilderness wanderings and stuff like that. So what's your take? Is there anything that can historically confirm this sort of phase of the Exodus?
I think there is. Okay, now we have to we have to sort of temper expectations here too. The wandering happened over a relatively short period of time, 40 years, and they're wandering from place to place. Okay, they're not staying in the same place. They're also not. We also have to understand that the environment at the time of the late Bronze Age of Sinai was more of a savanna. Okay, it had grasslands. Basically, Shasu used to herd their flocks there. You know, well, you don't herd your flocks where it's a desert. Today, it's a desert. There's no water there. There's no vegetation to speak of, except for the very occasional torrential rain, which doesn't happen very often in Sinai. But back in the late Bronze Age, it was still undergoing that drying out process from the Neolithic wet period. So during the time of, say, the wandering, there were acacia trees, there were olive trees, there were almond trees. Okay, so Sinai had trees. We know they had trees because at Serebet al-Qadam, we find slag heaps that were used to refine the ore they had there to bronze. So we know that Sinai had trees. We do know that shepherds used to take their flocks out there too. So when you've got this environment where there's trees and grasslands, you're talking about an environment that's a lot more like, say, Africa than it is, say, the desert of Sinai today. So what's going to happen is as people wander in, say, a savanna, there's going to be scavengers, there's going to be insects, there's going to be all sorts of things that sort of deal with, say, the remains that humans leave behind. In fact, we only know about, say, Bedouin sites in the Sinai because they've been going back to those same sites for thousands of years. It's that collected aggregation of thousands of years of human activity that we even know that the Bedouin were there. We know they've been wandering that area for thousands of years. But if you were to sort of track them, it'd be very, very difficult. But I think the most compelling evidence, say, for the wandering is actually the Song of the Sea. The Song of the Sea is basically, I think it's Exodus 15, where you get this song that recounts from the Sea of Reeds to the entrance of the Israelites into the Promised Land. Now, most scholars are going to place that around that. They're going to say that that's the oldest piece of scripture, and they're going to say that that was written down about 50 years after the Merneptah deal. So that's mid to late, mid to early 12th century BC. Now, that's a really important date because that's in living memory of the people who were wandering the Sinai. What it does is it establishes propinquity. You know, you're not just going to make something up out of whole cloth when everyone around you says, "What are you talking about? We didn't wander out there." So I think that's really compelling evidence to show that, hey, you know, this story of the wandering has merit. It has merit because this was a song written at the time when these people were still alive.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's absolute. Yeah, I think that's a great argument. What did you call it? The argument from propinquity?
Propinquity.
Propinquity. Okay.
It's how it's closeness, proximity of time or space. Like one of the things that I think is really a compelling argument for the late Exodus is the propinquity of Moses to Pharaoh. We don't think about this often, but for most of, say, Dynasty 18, the capital and Pharaoh's harem and his diplomats and all that were located in Thebes, hundreds of miles away from Goshen. with Ramses II, the capital moves from Thebes to right next door to Goshen at Paramses. That becomes the imperial capital of Egypt. So now Pharaoh is literally situated within 2 kilometers of Moses, right next door. So it shows you that this interaction between Moses going to Pharaoh's court and then coming back and talking to the elders and then going back to Pharaoh, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth is now feasible. It's feasible because Pharaoh's now your neighbor.
Yeah, makes sense. It fits, right? Like that jigsaw
It
puzzle.
fits really well.
Gotcha. All right, I like that. All right, well, okay, to put on your theological hat, because here's
Mhm.
one thing that I'm still a little bit skeptical with your take on some of these events, like the reed Sea of Reeds and the 10 plagues. Like you've kind of alluded to, well, they're historically plausible, but by appealing to natural events, they're just common natural events, and maybe you see it as miraculous because of the providence, so the timing. But when I read the stories, I really do see it as it seems to be referring to supernatural miracles. Like it talks about the water being massive walls on either side. I'm not sure that would the Sea of Reeds, when parted by wind, would it be towering walls and stuff like this? And same with the 10 plagues. Like it seems to be saying these are supernatural events with the power of God, and only we can defeat, the magicians of Egypt and stuff like that. So I don't know if the natural interpretation fits what the Bible's trying to say. So I'm just kind of curious on your take on that theological interpretational issue.
Okay. Now it strikes me that this is sort of, is the Bible here offering a supernatural explanation or a natural explanation? And which would these be contradictory? And I think that's a false dichotomy. Okay. Now let's take a look just at the verse Exodus 14, verse 21. And it says, quote, "The Lord swept the sea back by a strong east wind all night." Quote, did the Lord sweep back the sea, or did the wind sweep back the sea? The answer's both. Both. The text tells us it's a wind, but it also tells us it's the Lord. Lord, our God, is God of both the natural and supernatural. He does both. He's the God of all creation, spiritual and physical. If God decides he wants to send a wind to part the waters, he'll send a wind. It's still his doing. But he is more than capable of being Lord of both.
Okay, just to clarify, so I understand, like you're saying the sending of this eastern wind is the supernatural aspect, and then
Mm-hmm.
obviously, okay, so that's not a part based on what you were saying with the plausibility. Was when the Sea of Reeds is parted fully naturally. So God, forget the Exodus, God has nothing to do with it. Is it an eastern wind that does that, or is it a
Yeah, it's a wind from the east.
okay?
That's your wind set down. So this is what God is using at the exact moment that the Israelites need it. But he doesn't have to resort to just, I mean, it takes all night. It takes all night to part the waters. If this is a supernatural thing, you could just split it apart right then and there.
Right.
Now, would anyone follow after the Israelites after you see that happen? I mean, let's face it. Pharaoh and his army is right there. They're right there. They've caught the Israelites dead to rights. You know, the only thing that's separating Pharaoh's chariots from the Israelites is the pillar of fire and wind. The only thing that's separating them. The Israelites are boxed in. They've got the desert to one side, They've got Balsafon and Pihahirot on the other side, and their back is to the sea. It's the worst strategic position you could possibly imagine being in. You never, as an army, you never want, or a group fleeing, you never want your back to the sea. And here's Moses with all these people with the back to the sea. And the only thing that's separating him and Pharaoh's army is this storm. And from that wind in the east that parts the waters and they can make their escape.
Gotcha. All right, cool. And I would assume it's same deal with the 10 plagues, because you were saying, look, these are all things that are connected with through the agricultural issues and stuff like that.
Yeah, most of them are connected with the Nile inundation cycle.
Okay.
Like we have like for example in the Ipuwer papyrus, where it talks about the Nile turning to blood. Now we kind of have to understand too that when the Bible talks about blood in this way, it's not saying that the Nile turned red, but it turned black. Ooey gooey, icky black. This is like blood on the floor, kind of, you know, crime scene kind of blood, which is really awful if you've ever seen it. Just ugh. It's ooey, it's gooey, it's sticky, it's black, it's kind of like tar. It looks like tar. It's that kind of blood. Okay, so that's what it's suggesting that when the Nile turned to blood, it became this black awful mess that was you could barely stand to smell it, let alone drink it.
Gotcha. Okay. And last sort of follow up on this, I see what you're saying, and I've seen documentaries talking about this as a natural event and stuff like that as well. So the one thing I would ask too is about, like the religious conquests and stuff,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, for example, Moses turning his staff into a snake, the magicians can copy it, but then one way or the other, God prevails, proving,
Mm-hmm.
hey, I'm the true supernatural God. I'm the powerful one and stuff like that. Do you think those events could be fully explained supernaturally with God's input, or are those truly like fully supernatural events? I guess I'm just asking, like, which events, if any, do you think are like purely supernatural, like can't be explained through the use of natural mechanisms intervening and stuff?
The only event I would say that could not be really explained by, say, purely natural events is the Passover itself. Because it's very specific, it targets the firstborn, the heir designate. And when it talks about firstborn, it's not talking about first in chronological birth. It's really talking about who inherits the titles, the stuff, that sort of thing. Who's the prime inheritor? Who takes over for dad when dad dies and his job comes up for grabs. So these are these designated inheritors, the firstborn. They're the ones that are going to they're Egypt's legacy. They're Egypt's sort of management backup plan. So when they get sort of knocked off, as I said, it's oddly specific. It's particular to the firstborn, and I cannot at this point think of a good reason why a plague or would be specific to simply attack the firstborn. So I think there's a supernatural component to that one,
Gotcha.
without a doubt.
That makes sense. Yeah. All right, cool. All right, so yeah, I think that's it for that question on the theological one. You can put your Egyptologist hat back on here. And with this question, believe it or not, I was actually paying attention. You've already provided your answer to this next question about with respect to the late date of the Exodus, the one you go for in the 1200s. You've provided some archaeological evidence related to the conquest and the Judges period as supporting evidence for the late date of the Exodus there. So obviously, if there's anything else you want to add on that, go ahead. But what I
Yeah,
think,
there's one other thing. It also coincides with the late Bronze Age collapse.
right.
That's also an important factor in this. Is around 1184 BC, and really some years before then and some years after, the great powers of the ancient Near East go into decline. That's the year that the Hittite Empire crumbles to dust. And it's also the period where Egypt is sort of beleaguered by internal strife. And what this does, this Bronze Age collapse, what it actually does is it opens up the opportunity for a change in power in the Levant. It basically allows, say, the Philistines, the sea peoples, to take over the coastal plain. It also allows the Israelites to break up the Amorite Confederacy and basically between the Philistines and the Israelites divide Canaan between themselves essentially. And that's the reason they both these parties can get away with it is because of this late Bronze Age collapse. And it just happens at the early 12th century. So the timing is impeccable.
Gotcha. Yeah, that sounds very sound argumentation there, and again, it's all fitting together like a jigsaw. It has that explanatory power. There isn't like
Mhm.
a vagueness it's all fitting. It's not being forced to fit.
Yeah.
Okay, but let me ask you this, and I meant to ask this, but I didn't write it in the list. Let's take the early date then, and
Mhm.
same thing because I haven't heard you what I mentioned Bryant Wood. There are archaeological investigations into the conquest and judges periods that people like the Associates for Biblical Research and stuff will say, well, this actually supports the early date for the Exodus and that sort of thing. So what's your take on some of the archaeological evidence related to the conquest and judges period that is said to support the early dating of the Exodus, as well include the Mount Ebal curse tablet because I haven't heard
Okay.
anything in a couple of years on that. So
And I was actually just at ETS. This is the Evangelical Theological Society's annual meeting. And I actually sat in on the latest on the Mount Ebel Curse amulet given by Peter Gert van der Veen. Okay. So I got his take on this. And uh, I think this whole Mount Ebel Curse amulet thing has just fallen to dust. Um, I, they're trying Stripling and Vanderveen, Scott Stripling and Peter Vanderveen are trying to breathe life into this corpse, and I don't think they're very successful at it. Um, it- Basically, Vanderveen's paper was well, he sort of rubbished the work of Gershon Galil and basically said, well, his reading of the amulet was wishful thinking. But Vanderveen then said, well, but we still find cursed by Yahweh on the amulet. And I'm looking at their photograph, this is the same tomographic scan that they used last time. And I still don't see it. I still don't see it. Uh in fact, in a parallel paper at that conference, Richard Hess, commented on this and he says it still looks like a fishing weight to me. So if Richard Hess can't see an inscription on this, there's no inscription there. There's maybe a plausibility of one character, maybe, and I'd really hedge my bets on that one. I think every other character that Vanderveen read was wishful thinking too. So, but it's worse than that. It's worse than that because after that paper, I ran into one of the leading authorities on Mount Ebal, Ralph Hawkins, and we got to talking about the Mount Ebal site. And Hawkins has got his hands on the 100-page final ceramic report for Mount Ebal, and it's not published yet. Okay. But he said to me that there's no doubt that the site dates to late Bronze 2B, early Iron Age 1. There's no doubt. He says the ceramic topology is really clear, and there's no way you can wiggle your way out of that. So there's no possibility of that site dating to earlier than Late Bronze 2B, which is in the, say, the very late 13th century. Now, we kind of have to understand why this is such an important issue. Okay, that whole Mount Ebel thing is just, they're not going to give this one up easily. Okay, they've got too much at stake. This has become sort of a winner take all argument. Both say conservatives and say um, uh, basically fundamentalists are going to have put their sort of flag in the sand on this one. And as I said, it's a winner take all proposition. If, say, for example, the Mount Ebel site, if this site doesn't date to the 15th century BC, it's all over for the early Exodus date. It's not only just the winner take all, it's the loser lose all. Because everyone sort of agrees that the Mount Ebel site is the site of the biblical Mount Ebel. So everyone sort of who still believes in an Exodus and a conquest still, has basically said, okay, we all acknowledge that this is the site of that altar. Now, okay, now the fighting over the date is going to begin here, because there's no middle ground on this one. If it's 13th century, the late Exodus date wins. If it's 15th century, the early Exodus date wins. And it's just become, now when they sort of tried this to push the argument with the curse amulet, to say, okay, we've got this amulet, it's got writing on it, it's the epigraphy on it is clearly 15th century BC. We've got proof now for the early Exodus date. Game over. Well, that whole thing's now blown up. It's just the whole argument's imploded. There's really nothing legible on that amulet, and that's going to be a huge problem, especially once the final ceramics report comes out.
And what about other, like, it's older, but like things like Dr. Brian Wood, where there's nothing like the story of Jericho. If you look in the right period, the earlier period, like you find evidence of the walls collapsing and all this stuff that corresponds to the
Okay.
conquest of Jericho, whereas it wouldn't fit the late date and stuff.
Okay, now there's some problems with Wood's assessment here. Okay. First of all, those walls collapsing weren't collapsed walls. They are ramparts for battle rams. Okay. The Israelites never used battle rams. Okay. So that's an issue. We do know that there was grading on those ramps. So you don't get that with a natural collapse of the wall. Okay. So we know exactly what those ramps were used for. The other thing is Brian Wood's attempt to redate the ceramic typology to make the Middle Bronze II destruction date from 1550 BC to 1406 BC. That's all kind of falling apart too now. In fact, even ABR guys are now admitting it. I was at a paper, one of the papers I attended at ETS this year. One of the associates at Biblical Research basically said, yeah, we appreciate Bryant Wood's efforts here, but he wasn't correct. So even ABR is now admitting this, which was really shocking. They almost never sort of
Who was
pedaled
that?
back a position.
If you're allowed to say it, who was that was saying that?
That was Brian Wendell.
Brian Wendell. Okay.
Okay. Now, a lot's happened too since Bryant Wood's analysis as well. Like, for example, we have now discovered that there was a late bronze city at Jericho. This has come out with the research of Lorenzo Nigro. First of all, in his 2020 paper and then his 2023 paper. And he's really explicit in the 2023 paper. He basically has said that there was a mud brick fortification that ran around the perimeter. It was a fully occupied city in the late Bronze II period, and the destruction of it happened after late Bronze II-A. Well, there was a fallow period in Iron Age 1, so that leaves only one option for when the destruction happened, which is late Bronze II-B. So, now basically ABR is having to do the two-step now of us saying, well, how do we take that destruction to be destruction and now move it downwards, move it to older. So they've got some issues that these most recent excavations of Jericho have caused. And frankly, what Lawrence Nigro's report showed was that not only did he found a late Bronze II city at Jericho, but every other excavator did too. Because he went back into their journals, their archaeological journals, and found evidence of them finding late Bronze II-B pottery all over the place. In fact, when I sat in on that lecture, Wendell was trying to make the case that the destruction took place in late Bronze II-A, but then somebody in the audience asked, well, do we find late Bronze II-B pottery at Jericho? And he goes, oh yeah, all over the place. And I'm just sitting there going, what? Did I just hear that right? And just all over the place. Okay, if there's late Bronze II-B pottery all over the place on the site of Jericho, why are you trying to rebate the destruction to 2A? Well, they're doing it to try to save an early Exodus date. They're just doing it via the, say, not the 480s, but the Septuagint's version of, say, 14 or 440 years. So, yeah, they're kind of in disarray right now. They're just things have sort of gone sort of belly up for their sort of attempts to redate the destructions at Jericho.
Yeah, even I have to admit again, I'm not like an expert by any means in this area, but just based on my attempts at research, I told you 2 years ago, I would have been dragged kicking and screaming, maybe not screaming, but kicking definitely, because I was pro the early date kind of thing. But
I used to be an early dater too.
yeah, yeah,
I used to be one, and frankly, the guy I have to thank for becoming a late dater was Douglas Petrovich.
oh, nice. Okay, okay.
The way this happened was I was actually I was students with him at the University of Toronto.
Oh, wow. Okay, you're in my city. There we
I
go.
was in your city. I was in your city for a year. I used to live in Mississauga.
Oh, nice. Yeah,
Miss the restaurants. Oh my gosh. Toronto has great restaurants.
that is true. Yeah, we got
Much better than Vancouver.
okay, okay. That's it. Yeah, Toronto, we've got everything you can imagine. Like whatever you like to
Oh yeah.
eat, we've got it. So
Yeah, the dim sum is excellent. Okay, I'm gonna get into a foodie comment here if I don't stop myself. Okay, but when I was a student at Toronto, I really didn't care about the Exodus. Didn't care one whit about it. For me, was just sort of an esoteric thing, and it's like I wasn't that interested in it. I was focusing on Egyptology. Okay, but you know, Petrovich got wind that I had a Master of Divinity degree, and I was a Christian, and he asked me, he had gave me his paper, and he asked me to read it, and that we would discuss it later. I was like, okay, I'll read it. And I read it, and the Egyptology in it didn't make sense. It just didn't make sense. So it's like, okay, I said, look, I think the dating on your chronology here is kind of messed up. And, I said, I think there's some real issues with some of the ideas you have in this paper. And I said, like, for example, how do you reconcile the fact that Ramses was a virgin site? And he would deflect. He would deflect. He goes, well, what about the Sothic cycle? And I said, well, what about my question? Answer my question. How do you have, the Bible talking about the city of Ramses when we know it wasn't constructed, the city there wasn't constructed until Ramses II. And I never got an answer. It's like, okay, um, I'm going to look into this myself. I'm going to see, look at all the views, look at all the evidence, and come to my own opinions. And sort of it was so I actually owe this to, and the funny thing is I was a student of James Hoffmeyer. I was a student of James Hoffmeyer before then. But Hoffmeyer never pushed this, never really said clearly what his view was. So I'd been a student of Hoffmeyer's for years and really didn't know what his position was. So I didn't even know he was a late dater, after being a student of his for years. That's sort of the humility of Hoffmeyer, is he just didn't express his opinion to students, which actually could have been a little more helpful, honestly.
Yeah, yeah. One of my profs was like that too. He wouldn't give his position until the end of the semester. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a fair thing. It's a good thing for a teacher not to be, say, zealous about his own opinions, but sometimes a little guidance is helpful, just a little.
Just a little, yeah. Awesome.
But it was because of Petrovich that I started looking into this.
That's
Really, I mean, that's the reason. And of
yeah.
course, see, I became public enemy number one as soon as I did that.
Oh, good. Yeah, and then yeah, here you are. Yeah, I'm definitely leaning, even strongly, I would say at this point, to changing my mind, and I think you guys have the strength of the evidence on your side, and on that front, it doesn't matter. I mean, it doesn't affect any
Mhm.
theology, so
No, it
let's
doesn't.
follow the evidence and stuff like that.
Yes, follow the evidence. Yeah, and this shouldn't be something to divide over anyway.
Absolutely.
And it's very unfortunate that it's become like that, where it's almost become a kind of shibboleth test. Where people go, well, if you're not reading First Six Kings 6:1 literally, you're not reading the rest of the Bible literally. Wait, is that how we do biblical interpretation these days? Is by shibboleth test? You know,
Yeah.
I mean, I was sitting at a breakfast at ETS, and who joins us at the table but Wayne Grudem. Okay. And you know, like, introduce myself, and I say I'm an Egyptologist, and he goes, first thing out of his mouth, late or 1446, late or early date.
Okay, a nice way to break the ice, right?
Wonderful. Fantastic.
Oh my goodness. All right. Well, I want to ask you an interesting question. I don't know if
Okay.
it's something you've ever been asked before, but it's the issue of biblical prophecy. So this is the
Hmm.
last question. So you're a professional Egyptologist. I remember I went on a tour group with Egypt, and I remember trying to ask my tour leader at the time these questions. He just, get away from me, kid. You're a weirdo. Like, no, he didn't want to do this. So, I've got you here now. So I'm getting curious. There is this category of prophetic evidence called oracles to the nations, and it is a neglected line of argumentation for Christianity. I also, think that yeah, there's probably nothing to this or something in terms of proving a miracle. But I want to get your take as an Egyptologist. You would know all of the history and stuff like that. Um, what is your take on Bible prophecies regarding Egypt? Is there anything remarkable or extraordinary about it? And I'm kind of curious specifically about, there's a Twin Cities argument by John Bloom. I think I gave you the link, um,
Hmm.
where they take two Egyptian cities and they compare like Memphis versus the fate of Thebes. And they say, well, if someone was just randomly guessing, why these cities are comparable, they're the same. They just happen to guess correctly with respect to these two cities having opposite fates. Um, so yeah, what's your take on Bible prophecies and this twin city thing? Is there any merit to going, maybe there's something here?
Oh, well, okay. Here's the problem. We know a lot about Thebes. We actually know a lot less about Memphis. The problem with Memphis is, first of all, it's still a city under excavation. and not much of it has been excavated. There's a lot under the sand, so we don't even know what the final fate of Memphis was, how it was destroyed, even when it was destroyed. We have no idea. We know it survived into the Third Intermediate Period. But after that, things become very, very hazy for Memphis. So I wouldn't want to make a argument from prophecy based upon a city that we know so little about. There's some very important cities in Egyptian history that are like this, where we just don't have enough information or not enough digs have been done. Memphis is one. Heliopolis is another. This is the biblical Eon, which we find Joseph's story being referred to. Also, Ichitawi, the great capital of the Middle Kingdom. We know where it is now thanks to satellite imaging, but nobody's dug it up. It's even people are even asking, how do we dig up a city this big in and then try to sort of do the problem of, say, preservation and conservation of a city that where we don't even know what the architecture was like because we don't have any representations of Middle Kingdom architecture. They're all destroyed. So these are the sort of problems that, say, Egyptologists wrestle with. So then when we talk about, say, the destruction or the punishment of, say, Memphis in prophecy, well, you're getting it's pretty you're getting into sort of some speculative territory here. So I think when you start combining prophecy with speculation, it's probably not the greatest foundation to go on.
But you said we do know a lot about Thebes. I'm
We know
just
a lot about Thebes.
are there any biblical prophecies about things that cities or something like that that we do know about that you think have any merit, or is it just kind of the same thing we see in the ancient Near East in terms of prophecies? Or
It's going to be similar. I think there's some that are definitely stronger than others. I think the prophecy against Tyre is pretty solid. But we also have concurring evidence, corroborating evidence for the sacking of Tyre. Like one of the big things you often hear is that, Nebuchadnezzar never conquered Tyre. Well, we've got two cuneiform tablets from the period of Nebuchadnezzar. The first one is talking about a soldier who has to provision himself for the siege of Tyre. The second one is talking about, you know, Tyre as a province of Babylon. So, there's you have point A and you have point B. That infers that there was some sort of conquest in between point A and point B. Okay? So we do have stuff like that. Now, in the case of, say, the prophecy of, say, Nebuchadnezzar, um, you know, sacking Egypt, well, we do know that, say, the temples of Egypt were sacked a number of times. They were sacked under the Assyrians. The Assyrians, Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal, come through and clean that out. The Babylonians, during the Babylonian period, there's some sort of other sort of ransacking of the temples yet again. Can we place that exactly at Nebuchadnezzar's feet? Not necessarily. Could have been one of his generals doing it too on his own initiative. We just don't know. We don't have enough information. And then the Persians do it again. So there are these times when we do see invaders come through Egypt and basically steal all the silverware not nailed down.
I'm kind of curious on this skeptical end. This again wasn't on my list, but now I'm interested. Just to be fair, given your knowledge of the history of Egypt and stuff like that, are there any either Bible prophecies or just things about Egypt that the Bible states are facts that we know for certain are false? Like, are there any provable errors regarding Egypt?
I don't think there's any provable errors regarding Egypt. We do, like, for example, one of the prophecies is that Egypt will never be ruled again by a native king. That did happen. Nectanebo was the last native king of Egypt. After that, they're ruled by Persians and then Greeks and then Romans. Egypt never had a native king again after that time. So that That's a biblical prophecy that did prove to be true. The idea, there's also a prophecy that states that the Prince of Egypt will be driven back um, to Upper Egypt, Paresi. Okay, and that did happen too. During the Third Intermediate period, Egypt was sort of, you know, forced to sort of retract from outside invasions and basically also some of the internal dynamics as, say, Egypt fell to more Libyan influences. So, so these are sort of things that you can definitely say, okay, yeah, these are biblical prophecies. They do seem to be correct, at least with regard to the historical record.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, given your knowledge of stuff, there aren't any provable errors regarding Egypt at the
Now,
minute.
there's no provable errors, but regarding Egypt. But again, how do you prove prophecy? It's difficult.
It is. Yeah, yeah. It's definitely it's one of the reasons I. It's not the argument from
It's
Bible.
not a great argument.
It has the potential if you could pull it off, but it's just so hard to prove, number one, that the predictions are of an extraordinary character written before the
Mm-hmm.
events, and then proving the fulfillment gets really tricky and stuff like that, right?
Well, I find that if I just sort of say stick to the history, let's just stick to the history. You know, you don't have to go into the prophecy. See, this is one of the things that is, people ask me sometimes, well, why don't I use proofs for the existence of God? Okay. Frankly, I don't have to. You know, you show that the history is trustworthy. Those are the little things that build trust. Once people understand that the history is good, they'll start trusting the Bible on the bigger things. You don't have to prove the bigger things. Just show that it's reliable on the small stuff. And I mean, I use this argument on my most recent popcorn video, and I basically said, hey, you know what? We got to get the small stuff right, because if we don't get the small stuff right, it erodes trust. I used to work for an FDA company. I actually worked for two FDA regulated companies, and in the pharmaceutical industry, when the FDA comes in and does an audit, they're not looking at your chemistry; they're looking at your paperwork. And there's a weird kind of logic to this. Because you think as an outsider, well, the FDA, they come in, they're checking your chemistry and your beakers and all that. No, they're not doing that. What they're doing is seeing, are you following your processes? Are you doing all the paperwork correct? And they figure the paperwork's the easy part. That's the easy part to get right. If you can't get the easy part right, the paperwork, then who's going to trust you with the difficult part, the chemistry? I think this is a similar argument can be made here for how we present the Bible. If we get the history right, that's the easy part. Then people will actually start to trust the difficult part. The divine claims, the claims of prophecy, the idea of God existing eternally as three persons. These are the difficult things of the Bible. So that if you get the easy part right, they now have warrant to believe the more difficult portions. So we've never had to go into these sort of arguments for existence of God or prophecy arguments or anything like that, because you know get the easy stuff right and the rest takes care of itself.
Yeah, it's an interesting point about the different approaches because I for one, I am, for lack of a better way of saying it, I guess I was the top down. I did start in coming to faith with the God exists and then developing step by step kind of thing. But there, for a lot of people, that's not how they operate, and they come to faith
Yeah,
bottom up way, right? The way you're
yeah.
talking. So, yeah,
More people come to faith bottom up than top down.
I would agree with that for sure. Yeah, yeah. But at the end of the day, however you get there, it doesn't matter. If you've got warrant, I love that you use the word warrant. Not knowledge is a warranted true belief. It's not a justified true belief. Get out of here, you know, philosophy. But yeah, I love that you use that word. Yeah. So yeah, that that this was awesome. That's it for my list of questions. Let me turn it to you. Is there anything that I missed regarding the history of Exodus and that you think is really important?
No,
Just
we covered a lot here. You did some great questions, and I it was a real pleasure to answer them.
awesome. Awesome, awesome. Yeah, like I said, I'm really appreciative. I've been trying to do a show on this topic for 2 years now, so it felt amazing to finally get it out there and kind of see both sides and stuff like that. I would, I don't know, I don't want to take advantage of your niceness, but if you ever have a connection with somebody who disagrees with you on the dating and they're willing to like do a debate or a discussion, that would be awesome too as a follow-up. But I know it's kind of hard to,
I I
yeah.
used to do debates on this, and then people got wind of it. It's like,
Oh,
they won't debate me anymore,
oh, goodness. Okay. Fair
not
enough.
especially not after that Titus debate.
Yeah, that was a little brutal and stuff like that.
Yeah, that was kind of rough.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right, awesome. Well, like I said, thank you so much for coming on, David. It's always
My
a pleasure
pleasure.
talking to you and stuff like that. It's the second time on, so you're welcome back on my show anytime for any topic you want to talk about.
All right, sounds good.
All right. So just so the audience knows, I've got two more shows this week, so you're not getting rid of me. Next up, I have Massimo Paris coming back to talk about, he thinks the Our Lady of Guadalupe as a Marian apparition is proof for Roman Catholicism. So he's going to be talking about the evidence, and there's scientific evidence for this that he wants to present. As well on Friday, I'm continuing on with David's favorite, Shroud Wars series. I'm bringing on skeptic Hugh Ferry versus Mark Guskin to discuss their image, Hugh Ferry's image forming mechanism. He takes sort of a artistic powder rubbing type approach, similar to Luigi Garlashelli, where they use a bas relief with powdered pigments and a slurry, and they daub the images onto the cloth. So we're going to be evaluating that. Does it stand up to scrutiny or not? But other than that, have a great week, everyone.